couple weeks ago, my email inbox notified me that I had a fresh new email from Free to Be Faithful. It was the fall 2025 issue of Update, where they provide for us news about what's going on in the Synod regarding issues of religious freedom. And I get a lot of emails in my inbox, and I get a lot of newsletters that come to me. Frankly, most of them I don't bother looking at very closely. I don't pay much attention. This one I tend to look at because I have a more than passing interest in these sorts of things. Church and state, kind of interesting to me. Issues about the temporal realm, spiritual realm, I'm always tuned in. And so this is one of these newsletters that I actually look at and read with some interest. Now, in case you missed it in your own inbox and maybe you didn't get an email and you didn't get a chance to see the Free to Be Faithful newsletter, let me call your attention to the lead article. It's titled, "The Beckett Fund Defends the Synod's Right to Govern Itself in Keeping with Lutheran Doctrine." Now, I'm very interested now because I'm keenly interested in what's going on with our Synod regarding how we interact with the world around. And this is a hot topic right now because this is the issue regarding the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and the lawsuit we have filed against Concordia University, Texas, over about governorship, who's going to run the show down there and all that. That's a whole other topic for another time, but this is the Beckett Fund is an organization who's decided they're going to come to the Synod's aid in arguing our case in this situation, which is kind of strange because the Beckett Fund is really interested in defending religious liberty. You can go to their website, check it out, and see what they're doing, and they've got all kinds of cases they have represented and cases they are representing, all in the name of religious freedom. And they're rather, liberal in how they defend things. They defend Catholics and Protestants, and they'll defend Muslims, all kinds of people in the name of religious freedom. And that's another whole topic altogether. But the odd thing is, what in the world would a lawsuit of the Missouri Synod against one of our universities, which seems rather inter-church and has nothing to do with the secular world, which raises questions about why we're in court in the first place, but again, that's another issue. But the question is, what has that got to do with religious liberty? Well, the Beckett Fund tries to make this clear, and that's why this is interesting. So what this newsletter has actually done is they actually simply published the case summary from the Beckett Fund's website describing why they're representing this case and what the issues are at work in this case. So it's kind of fascinating. What's also fascinating is it's not written by anybody in the Missouri Synod. Somebody from the Beckett Fund wrote this, and the Beckett Fund is primarily funded by Roman Catholics, but that's another sidebar. So this is written by the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, and it's the case summary of the case that has been filed in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on April 20th, 25, and this is the opening brief, the 71 pages laying everything out, and this is actually a little more cogent, but the summary is trying to tell you what this is all about. So here's what the summary says. A kingdom not of this world. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod believes that its church is fundamentally, quote, not of this world, unquote, and must be protected from control by the state. These beliefs, shaped by the tradition's historical suffering of persecution and state co-option, have caused the church 130 years ago to create a civil corporation, the LCMS, to represent the church before civil courts and to manage the church's property, contracts, and legal affairs. But the church's ecclesiastical body, known as the Synod, exercises the church's spiritual authority and governs the church's religious beliefs. This distinction between spiritual and secular authorities is the key religious belief underpinning the church's organization and governance. This structure allows the church to stay focused on its religious mission while LCMS supports that mission, among other places, in court. Now, I read that and I was scratching my head from the very beginning, and maybe you are too. The one sentence in this whole thing that kind of makes sense and is right is in the middle where it says, this distinction between spiritual and secular authorities is a key religious belief underpinning the church's organization and governance. True. The distinction between the spiritual and the temporal realms is critically important, and I've talked about this incessantly for many years now, teaching about this, and it's vital to remember that we have a spiritual realm thinking about our relationship to God, and then the temporal realm that deals with our relationship with the world around us. The thing to remember, though, is that we as human beings, and even our institutions of the three estates of the church and the home and the government, all three of those estates function within both of these realms and interact with these realms all over the place. And the mistake of trying to divide the two realms into spiritual things and merely temporal things is always wrong-headed. This manifests itself when we think about how the sacraments actually work, that sacraments are visible, material, tangible, temporal things with spiritual things shot through them. When we think about a human being being utterly temporal and yet utterly spiritual. When we think about how the church functions then as a spiritual reality beyond time and space and yet grounded in temporal, real life, visible people and visible congregations. This is the reality we deal in. These things are always interacting all over the place. But we make a distinction, but we don't divide them apart, and we don't separate them apart. And that's part of the problem that's going on here, is there's a lot of separation going on. But things get even more bizarre if you've been listening. So let's go back up and kind of look through some of these things. The first claim is this Missouri Synod is not of this world. We are a church fundamentally not of this world. Okay, fair enough. We are a spiritual reality that transcends time and space, not of this world. But again, we are utterly grounded in the realities of this world. That's how sacraments work. That's how preaching works. That's how everything we do works. It's in the temporal world with spiritual realities infusing all of it all and interacting with all and interlocking all of it. Anyway, now, the other thing is historically interesting that makes the comment about our tradition's historical suffering of persecution and state co-option. And the brief makes it a little clearer. Oh, they're talking about when we started as a synod way back in Germany, and we have the Kaiser deciding he's going to tell the church what to do and force it to join up with the Reformed, and then we, of course, refuse, and we flee to America and settle in Perry County. All right. There's your persecution. And my good friend down the hall, Dr. Bodie, will often remind me that, yeah, there were times in history where the Deutsch, the Germans, were often persecuted and ridiculed and vilified by the people who were here first. And St. Louis has plenty of stories about the Deutsch being persecuted for being German. But I'm not sure if that really qualifies as persecution for our religious faith or for being Lutheran. So it's a bit of a stretch, but the whole thing is kind of weird because it makes it sound like we are a minority, oppressed group, harassed and hounded by the state and persecuted by others, which is fanciful to say the least. Anyway, I find that a little bizarre. But the bigger point that I'm really concerned about is this next move, where it says, the church 130 years ago was led to create a civil corporation, the LCMS, to represent the church before civil courts. And this is the thrust of this whole thing, that the church does spiritual stuff and then the LCMS does temporal stuff. This is what's really bizarre about this, that we end up having two things going on here. We've got a spiritual church, which the document calls Synod, and then we have the LCMS, which is a corporation formed so that we can be involved in these nasty, dirty, civil things without polluting the spiritual Holy Church. Now, that's not said, but it's more or less implicit. And we have this weird bifurcation between the material and the temporal, as if, or the material and the spiritual, and the temporal and the eternal, as if somehow the temporal things aren't worthy of our attention or are going to pollute us or somehow drag us down. Now, the intervening part of this article gets into the details of the lawsuit filed by Texas and the Synod and the Synod case, and the fact that it was dismissed in the first court because it was decided that the LCMS had no standing because the LCMS didn't start that university, but the church, the Synod, did. And so there's a technicality. So the Synod LCMS bifurcation was introduced by the defense marshaled against the LCMS's suit, and so now we're just kind of picking up and flowing with that. So that's kind of where this all got generated from. They're the ones who introduced this idea, and that's why we were dismissed as, well, you're not relevant, you don't have any case to bring because the LCMS is not involved in this, and it was dismissed. And then that's why we filed the appeal, and that's where the Beckett Fund got involved, because the Beckett Fund says, whoa, 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 whoa. The government, the court, is wrong to say the LCMS has no standing because the LCMS is the corporation we have founded as Synod so that they can do our dirty work. And they're perpetuating this division. So then let me read again from their summary, one more quote from them, a little longer section. The law protects the church's right to organize itself. And this is the key thing that the Beckett Fund's worked up about. They see this as an infringement on the Synod's right to do things the way we want, no matter how weird it looks to anybody else. And they make us look really weird, frankly. But here we go. Even though LCMS, remember that's the institution that is filed for the sake of the corporate temporal world, even though LCMS has always handled the church's, that would be Synod, legal affairs, including its relationship with Concordia, that would be CTX, a federal court said it couldn't bring the case in court. The court claimed that only the church's spiritual body, the Synod, had the right to sue. So that's where this bifurcation came in. But now we're going to play off of this. But the Synod is a purely spiritual body. It doesn't own property, have bank accounts, sign contracts, or go to court. That's LCMS's role, and it has been for 130 years. This arrangement isn't just practical, it reflects the church's belief in a clear distinction between spiritual leadership and civil authority. LCMS handles legal affairs, the Synod leads on doctrine and spiritual matters. This is crazy stuff, guys. We have this weird thing where we have the Synod is doing the spiritual stuff. Meanwhile, the LCMS is doing the temporal stuff. It reminds me so much of the standard trope in all the sitcoms that were popular when I was a kid. Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, where you have the evil twin shows up. And so Samantha's evil twin, her weird little cousin, who looks just like her, but does all these nasty things. Or I Dream of Jeannie's evil sister, who does all these nasty things. And that's exactly what we have going on here. We've got our doppelganger. We have the LCMS does all of our dirty work for us so we can be a pure spiritual church. Who in the Synod, who in the LCMS, if there's a difference, who in our church body has any concept of this distinction between LCMS, Inc., and Synod, spiritual church body? Who operates this way? No one. Nobody thinks this. And then they pass this off as this is a core part of how we do it. It reflects a clear distinction between the spiritual, as if this is how vitally important it is that we have this distinction. This is muddling things horrendously, and it's pushing a huge divide between the spiritual and the temporal, which is frankly messed up. Now, we didn't create this big bifurcation. That was the move made by the defense from CTX. All right, but we're leaning into it. We're acting like this is the solution, that the Synod is the LCMS only for temporal things, and so that's why the LCMS has the right to sue. Whatever. The legal merits of the case, that can all get decided. It'll happen in the Court of Appeals. Fine. That's a whole other topic. I'm concerned about the theology underneath and the very notion that we're perpetuating and endorsing this idea of these two separate things, a pure spiritual Synod and a temporal corporate LCMS. And we have corporate things going on and then Synod things going on. You see, when we start thinking this way, this gives us the latitude to do all kinds of nasty stuff as LCMS, because that's just our evil twin doppelganger over there doing those nasty things. We're still a pure church body just doing spiritual things. We're just interested in mission. But you see, mission is what happens in the temporal realm. And what we do in the temporal realm, in courts and in legal proceedings and in interacting with the world around us, is part of our mission. We need to do both things all the way down. We are a single church. There is one church with a visible aspect and an invisible aspect. This applies clearly to sacraments and to congregations and to the reality of our spiritual being. But it also applies to how we interact with the temporal world around us. We can't make this neat little division of saying, oh, that's just temporal stuff. It hurts our witness. It compromises who we are as church, and it gives us this notion that somehow we can bifurcate our own lives into spiritual and temporal things and just do temporal things when we have to while we keep our spiritual self pure. It's nonsense. We can't operate that way. We are people who are spiritual and temporal all the way down. We are a church that is spiritual and temporal all the way down. And the distinction between Synod and LCMS is made up, frankly. There is not any foundation theologically for this divide. And if somebody tries to claim a theological foundation for it, they are misunderstanding Luther's teaching on the two realms, and they are misappropriating all of our heritage when it comes to this distinction between the spiritual and the temporal realm. They're overplaying their cards masterfully. So, those are my thoughts on this latest newsletter from Free to Be Faithful. And it matters not just because it bugs me, which it does, but it matters because it goes to the core of what it means for us to be church and how we witness to the world around us, and whether or not we're paying attention to our witness in all the stuff we do, including our legal proceedings and including our public face we put forward to the world around us. Do you think the world makes a distinction between Synod and LCMS? Come on. We can't make that distinction ourselves the way this Beckett Fund wants us to see it. No one else is going to see that. They just see the church out there playing like everybody else does in the world, fighting for its rights and demeaning what it means to be the people of Christ, who actually follow Christ in a way that shows the reality of Christ being utterly different. Let's get serious about who we are as church and not let the Beckett Fund define who we are, but define who we are according to our own theology.